Hi guys, so today I'll be taking a look at all of your work that you handed in, so the personal work handed in to the homework submission text channel. This is this month's reward. There won't be any time-lapse art because I have not been able to complete any. My life has been extremely busy and I'll be moving and relocating to a new place very soon. So I thought the best reward I could give you guys, apart from, you know, what I paint myself, is just to take a look at what you guys have been painting, your personal work, and help you guys along with your workflow. So I'll be taking a look at these in groups. So the ones that were handed in come from different directions. Some are referenced, some are portraiture, and some are illustrations with lighting issues, and then we have a bit of a referencing gesture piece right here. So I'll be doing my best to cover all of these today as thoroughly as I can, even if it hits 2 hours as a recording. I am sorry if my voice goes. I'm trying very hard not to talk too loud and talk as calmly as possible so that my voice lasts as long as possible. So let's jump right in. For this piece, it's jumbled up. It feels like a big bundle of stuff. There is no breathing room. So some of the quickest changes I can make have to do with angularity, creating angles of sight. So I would want to have, in a portrait, at least have some kind of angle between his neck and his jawline, just to get this negative space right here. I would want his head tilted up just a little bit more, just so that we can get a more holy representation, that holy pride, and then the halo and all of this fiery kind of suggestion here that he's some kind of holy character because we have a full halo going on. I would darken the entire scene under the environment purple that you have and allow only the yellow orange to come through and shine. So those are all the changes that I will be making. Actually, let me keep these guiding lines here. All right. So I'm selecting the head first and cutting that out, and then just tilting along the decision I made with my lines, and that will really help give us some character. And then we have the neck and the rest of the body, which is sort of, you know, kind of very stiff, very still. And then if there is some kind of holy kind of character here behind this, then they have some, you know, there's a story going on. And usually these characters in biblical books or any kind of monotheist story, they always have some kind of these prophets or whatever the character's going through. If it's not necessarily a prophet, we're still working out of that narrative. They go through some kind of test, there's some kind of distress. So that's kind of what I'm trying to encapsulate here with the expression that I'll be adjusting. I'll be bringing in some extra little droop in the eyebrows. The thing is, you drew a kind of a front-facing eye, and that's problematic because what that's done is it's completely thrown off the rotation. We don't see any of the forms that are supposed to be visible from a side view compression. So we are only supposed to see the side of the eye, which means we're seeing half the eyeball, which means we're seeing half the eyelids that dress the eyeball. Simple basics. And that's really the biggest problem we had here. The nose should have a lot more elevation. So I'm just going to push it all the way out. And that may seem a little silly to you right now from where you're standing, but we need to make large motions and then adjust thereafter. And so I'm just trying to bring in some more volume visible from a side view. So I've said this before, don't try to do a side view masterpiece without some reference. And if you use the reference, measure your reference. Tracing is not a bad thing for education. Tracing is bad when you say that you didn't trace. And tracing is bad when you trace everything. I would trace measurements, and that's something I've always told my students to do. And I encourage you to do the same thing. So I'm just going to bring in a little stylistic droop right there into the eye, just to make it feel like the head is lifted and tilted away from us, and that'll give that chin a bit more strength. When a man has a beard, the chin is lifted up a bit. Give him an Adam's apple as well. Don't forget that. And then bring down that cloak. All right, so big changes, and I think it's really helped the character along. And let's just take a look at the before and after just from here. So before, see how he feels all jumbled up and kind of stuck in one spot. and after a lot more breathing room and a bit more expression to do with that character. And then finally I'm going to get that blue, drop it everywhere, and darken, and just make sure it's sitting on top of all of these features. And then I will delete with a soft brush anywhere where we're supposed to have some kind of flaming contrast. I wouldn't worry about applying it to him. Something that I don't really care for is an overly as contested focal point. I don't feel like we need one. I don't feel like we need to force it because the character's position is beautiful in the canvas. What I do feel like you need to do is maybe brighten the background just a little bit, just so that he kind of comes out of his environment just a touch. Something like that might help. Or you make him brighter than the halo behind him. So you had to choose between the halo and the character. I would choose the halo just because it seems like you're going for that dark kind of like environment where we're looking at the character through a really, really abstract storytelling, right? Where we have these really cool saturation exposure, and it just seems like it's deliberate that you brighten these halos up. So dodge tool isn't really doing much for me right now, and I'm gonna just raise the volume. Oh, I see. It's because I wasn't deselected. Is it still doing it? It is, and that's okay. And I'm gonna just bring in a volume change. And that should push the piece along nicely. You've used a tiny, tiny brush for the hair. You never do that. You use a large brush, and with the bristles of this brush, which I will give you this month, you create the illusion of texture, not actual texture. I'm going to let a brush stroke or two stay unblended just so we can build some blocks. Just like that, just so we can have some surface texture to the character. And then I'm going to let, again, the feathering edge of that brush create the feeling of beard. So you can see each brush stroke, but it's not. But from a distance, it definitely reads as that. And that's exactly how we interpret texture through the illusion created by brushstroke grain. We never actually paint every single little hair. Big, big beginner mistake. There's so much finesse and so much grace to be had in using a small brushstroke, a large brushstroke, I'm so sorry. And it doesn't mean you can't shrink the brush. It means that you just have to shrink it along a bed of large brushstrokes that have already established the texture. So we never ever paint every single individual hair with a tiny 1 pixel width brush, ever. He kind of looks like he's smiling, which is really nice. It's kind of he kind of has this very gentle expression, but also seems like a very tormented prophet. And we have this really nice texture getting built up now, and I don't mind much of the larger brush strokes towards the top. And we are leaving some of your brush strokes behind, but only some of them. And that's because you are allowed, after a good body of large and medium brush strokes to create the grain of the hair, you can use a handful, less than a handful of brush strokes that are pixel width. Even then, they don't even have to be that small for us to pull off a read. This lower lip is much darker than the rest of the face because it's under the umbrella of the mustache. As for your framing, you could have done a much better job framing. I feel like you could have maybe pushed the character more to one side. so that you have a better placement for that halo, so the halo feels more circular and less like a blob, because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about these like prophetic characters. They always have a perfect circular halo or something like a perfect circle happening. So that way you have some breathing room, and it feels a little bit more open and less constricted. Okay, actually, so let's see where our original sketch lines were. That's definitely helped us, and let's see where it was before. Really jumbled up, kind of unexpressive, very weak design, because you were not using lines of sight and shape, and now we've controlled the lighting, we've controlled everything, and we've decided on one thing to stay bright, and that has really brought in a lot more grace to the scene because we're not overdoing the contrast. For this piece, the tile canvas is a big mistake. It's not really telling a story about the environment, it's telling a story about the character. And exactly the same situation here. We darken the entire scene and choose not to darken. So I'm going to darken the scene, cool it down, and we're choosing not to darken anywhere that is yellow, because that, again, is the highlighter that we've decided carries the focal point. And make the brightest point of that right over here. Lots of halos today. And as you can see, that alone has created a really nice, believable environment. And out of that yellow that we've just discovered, which I will dodge, we can bring in a secondary light, or primary in this case, because there isn't much going on anywhere else, and use that to illuminate the character. So wherever the character is exposed to this light. And I think that will make the painting go a very, very long way towards a more believable environment. Okay, and as for contrast against the background, I would definitely try to decide, like I would decide what's brightest, the character or the background. In this case, it's really up for grabs. So this means that is it darker outside or lighter? And is this the only light source in the area? So if it's darker out, that means that we have a character that is illuminated only with one light source. This canvas is massive, which still works. If it's lighter outside, then the character is the darkest of the scene, which means we have to choose a shadow color. I guess I would stick to the one you have already, just this reddish brown, and the character being darker than the environment. You can't have a character that has the same exposure as the environment. It doesn't make much sense. Which is where, if that's what happens, that means there's no light and it's dark outside. That's when you see nothing. You only see things because of, by comparison, things are visible. So the character being darker is kind of boring because it's not really helping the secondary light source along. We want it to feel like that's the only light in the area and there is no other light in the scene. So the background being darker actually works. Okay, so I'm going to darken the background ever so slightly, and as you can see, it really helps the scene feel a lot more dramatic. And I'm going to just push that to blue ever so slightly. It's not, I'm not here, but it's just enough of a push to blue that we have a more of a cool representation of the environment. And I'm just going to smudge. So all the brushes that I used for this critique will be given in the rewards this month. I always try to include my brush sets as part of the rewards whenever I can. I love when my students can have the actual tool I use so they can see that it's, you know, fundamentals are really the stars of the game. It's not the brush, but you guys still want the brush. I know you do. You guys are obsessed with brushes. But again, it's not about the brushes that make the changes. The changes are made because of a respect for the fundamentals. And I'm just going to use like a purpley no, I can't do that. I'm going to just use the shadow color from the base here to try to unite the character with their environment. Because we can't really have this excessive presence of another color when the dominant color of the scene is either bad guy green or the you know, tool or whatever weapon he has. It seems like this weapon doesn't belong to him. It feels like he stole it and it's like a holy weapon, but of course he wants to use it, and he's a dark creature that's not supposed to use that weapon. Maybe he killed someone honorable or someone that has once used that weapon, and now he keeps it for himself, which is really cool. The front part of the shin bone should not be exposed to the light because it's looking away. And then there's something cool you can do. You can bring in an environment color to create a feeling of fog. Any kind of gray will help bring in just any new values just to help the scene along. Just to create some space in the background. Maybe some mountainous fog in the background. Alright, and we'll do a comparison of the before and after. Really good, almost Peter Moorbacher colors. So before, we did not miss those sides of the canvas. We just did not miss them. And after, a little bit more focused. The framing itself, it feels like the canvas should be more this way. Because he's occupying too much of the upper half of the canvas and he's not at the centermost part of the canvas. His head should be closer to the center. And now that we have all this space in the background, we can really have fun with some mountainous kind of imprint back here. Oopsie. And that's just a simple raising of the contrast just against the background, something like that. And multiple layers. Maybe we can see the background behind him and he's in some kind of valley. Now that we have all this space above. Another thing that you can do to occupy that space is just run along with the halo narrative. So soft light brush mode, low opacity, and we're just bringing that, oops, I'm still on select. We're just bringing that halo down onto the character. Just like that, from above, pushing into white. And of course, we don't just do it like this. We have to go backward and delete at whatever the light does not see. And cast some shadows as well. So only the tops of the shoulders are really getting some of that light coming from above. And it's not a lot. It's just an indication. And I'll make it a bit more triangular. You can also have it coming in as at an angle, something like that. Alright, so flatten. So let me know if you guys like this kind of reward system. It's just been crazy. I have not been doing any personal work. It just happens. I'm your teacher, and it's okay that it happens. I'm here to tell you that it's possible. But I also don't want to encourage it. Always try to push yourselves to do studies. I'm studying every single day I teach. So as I teach students, I myself am doing every form study. I'm sharing in the experiences. I'm doing studies on the side and little sketches here and there, but as for full-fledged personal work, that has just not happened. And that, I just wanted to take a moment and talk about it, that it can happen. It's possible. And when it is possible, don't force it. I've just stopped trying to force it because though I define myself by my output and what I produce, I can still draw. I do it every day. I do it right now. I'm doing it right now as I teach you. I can still apply and design and create, but for some reason, it's just not, my own narratives just don't seem to be present. It may be because I'm going through a transformative time in my life. It may be because I'm at a burnout when it comes to narratives. It may be because my tastes are maturing and I am no longer entertained by the same stuff. So movies that used to be amazing for me, I watch them now and I'm just like, it could have been better. Stories and genres that used to entertain me now are boring to me. So tastes change, people mature, suffering changes us, good things changes, time changes us. My lower back problem, upper back problem definitely has changed me. I hope not for the worse, but I think that because I've become impatient and no longer wanting to sit on the chair for too long, my decisions in the art world are way more efficient. I'm making faster decisions. I'm not dilly-dallying. I'm not kind of relaxed as much before with my decisions, and I feel like I benefited a lot. I know it's weird to say that, but my back pain has benefited me so much. So don't pressure yourselves too much if you're not creating personal work. But today we are looking at personal pieces. Some are studies, and some say that, oh, I haven't done much personal work in the past couple months. I am right there with you. It's completely understandable. If you are doing studies, if you're still learning and fundamentals aren't at your command yet, then it's a wonderful way to use your time. So let's talk about this piece. It's a bit all over the place. We have to always address the universal light source. Universal light source is a sunset, which means we have black, almost silhouette mountains. We do not have side light because the sun is not beside the mountains. The sun is behind the mountains. So which word is more accurate to describe the sun, behind or beside? So there's no argument there, because obviously the only way we can describe it is the sun is behind the horizon, under the earth, behind the earth and where we're standing. And so that means that we aren't getting these side lights. The sun is not coming in from the side. We can see it right there. That alone has drastically affected the entire scene. You do not have the lighting scenario to promote whatever we're seeing here, and that's why it looks messy, and that's why it looks off. So the best way, look at that, just that alone has fixed the scene. Isn't that crazy? Because we've respected the light source. Let's select inverse. Always ask where the light source is coming from, and all the questions will be answered. So I want to do this and not ruin the tree. So I'm going to just brighten that back. It is about the background, it is about the tree, but the characters are still front and center in the storytelling. So don't feel like, oh, because my characters are the main characters, I have to make them more illuminated than the sun itself. No, absolutely not. You have chosen a silhouette in your environment. Respect the initial choice for the light environment. Always respect it. It will make all other choices very, very easy to grasp. Everything else falls into place. You make one good choice, and this is the rule. Write it back to me, by the way. I do want to see this written back to me. I love when you guys write stuff back to me. It means that you will never forget this fundamental now that you've written it down. So once you decide on one good choice, all other good choices fall into place. And the best choice to make early on is a light environment choice. It asks the question of where's the light source coming from, which is the best and most healthy proactive question to ask as an artist, as a student. It also begs the question, what color is the light source? What situation of the light source do we have? Do we have a full-fledged, exposed scene, or do we have a silhouette? It answers all your questions. After that, you know how to dim everything. Excuse me. You know how to choose all your values. Everything else falls into place. I brightened the background up just a bit so we have no muddiness towards the upper part of the canvas. I'm trying not to get rid of the saturation you have up there because it's definitely present in a sunset scene. I'm also trying to bring in that washed out background environment color. So now that we have that, I'm going to blur these mountain edges because I used lasso. Some of these mountains are further off than others, which means that I have to address that. I've never done this many critiques in this short a time, so bear with me. I'm so sorry that I have to, my voice is already kind of getting there. But yeah, bear with me with all the lassoing I'm gonna have to do. Be on lighten, actually, not soft light. And I'm going to just gently bring in that high, oopsie, did not connect that horizon the best way I could have. And I'm just bringing in this distance between the two mountains. So there's going to be one large brush stroke to separate them from each other. And then, and then there's going to be that extra bit of distance over there between them. So this little bit right here in between the mountains, this little darkened or lightened half of the mountain, you would get away with it if you were talking about a sunset that was setting over here but still a silhouette, but you're not really getting away with it right now, so we need to dim that more towards the foreground just a little bit. And I'm just trying to get rid of any extra kind of unimportant information for a background mountain. You know, it's just a background mountain at the end of the day. And it's acting like it's a front ground mountain or foreground mountain. Make that mountain a little more humble. All right, and then we do have, because we're in the shadow of a mountain and the sun is directly behind, and you should, when we're not doing that, that means the sun is peeking over the horizon, which is beautiful, but that means that you're going to end up having a focal point up here, which means you're going to have to illuminate her butt, and then it's just going to be about that. What I would suggest is leave everything beautiful and washed out, just like so. And then focus on this. Focus on the magic water. There's magic water, so focus on that. Let's just dim everything else and create some room to express the narrative through. So this magic water can glow, and it has its like own little light source set up, which means we can borrow from it to tell the story with another light source. And that means we are borrowing from, I think I'll just leave it like this and then just go to color mode and apply that color on anything that light is touching. And that's how we create a successful multi-light source scene. All right. And so we managed that. I'm going to color dodge my brush and just throw some in this way, throw some in that way. And again, with those micro textures, we don't need them. They damage your painting more than help it. There are other ways of creating a bluish mist that don't require you to stipple in every last little particle of that mist. So I'm just throwing that blue in over here and trying my best to express this as a light source, but as a milky light source, nothing too strong. That's already hitting strong. So that means when we use sponge tool, we saturate. And that means in order to saturate, sponge tool sometimes illuminates. So saturating this can actually mean more. It's turning it into a little bit of a blue when I saturate, so I'm going to try to color correct that back into more of a milky hue. But I'm still getting that saturation that I like. Okay, so now we have two warring colors, which feels better in the scene, feels a lot more healthy. And you just have to go back and adjust some of these shadows. She may have a bit more of a silhouette on her feet because they're more in front of the light source than her body is. Her body is more part of the new environment, which is the nighttime. That's the new, most recent update to the clock. So she's already inside the new clocked time, which is nighttime. Her feet, however, are still part of the daytime in that they're just touching the sun, but not really because they're just right in front of it, which means they can afford to be a little bit more dark. So I'm going to try to pull that off with burn tool on midtones. And I'm just darkening her feet just a bit more. See how that helps? Just a bit more than the rest of her body. And look at that environment we're creating. Really, really beautiful. And then I'm just going to try to cool it down with a more purple presence by using color. Just to cool it down, pushing closer into, closer into the purples. Just cooling down those feet. And then we just want to do a bit of framing because we're in the darker half of the canvas. So again, cooling down and just darkening the lower half. Just to show that it's not really about the background, no matter how visible that sun is. I think I didn't dim that sun as I should have, and that's okay. And then there's the shadow of the mountain, which kind of sits across the environment. But this is a distance, so we're not going to carry that light all the way forward. It's going to be just a little bit of light sitting back there. And we're trying not to create the feeling of, an interrupted light environment. We're just only hinting at the possibility that the sun can still touch some of the areas that are exposed to the light. And then there's the distance itself. Like we want to make the characters generally more, generally more dark than the background, even in a situation like this one. So I would, just behind the head and the nine tails there, I just want to make a bit of an environmental haze in the background, just some kind of perspective. Unless this is all the same ground, it doesn't feel like it is, but if it is the same ground, don't do this. But this is just so that we can push that off into the distance. Okay, and then select inverse, and then the same thing with this character's tails. I would just try to darken them somehow. Oh, right, I'm not on the right layer. So darken that character's tails just a bit more. It feels like he's kind of hazed and not really part of the environment. But this has gone a long way. Those flowers should be in the dark. And then you've got this little mound right here that the tree is on that is also not dark enough. And it shouldn't be that dark. I would get rid of the tree. But your entire composition, your elements and staging is a bit weaker. It's on the weaker side, so no matter how many environmental and atmospheric changes we apply, they're still going to be on the weaker side. And if this is like a glowing spring, it would glow thoroughly all the way around and have like a bit of an outward halo coming out of the ground. So I'm going to just make it do that. Just something like that, just to help the feeling like this is a light source in its own right. Trying not to overdo it in the main part of the spring, just like that. And that kind of lowered the frame of the painting a little bit, but that's okay. I'd rather that because it's pretty much occupying the lower half of the canvas a little too much. It's not that the character needs to be repositioned in the canvas, it's that the entire camera needs to be repositioned, which is a little too much work right now for a for this piece. So you have a hazy scene. It's supposed to be a romantic scene. I don't mind that there isn't much contrast between the character and the background. I think we have enough compared to where we were before. But of course you still have the option of just making that throwing that background even more into the distance. So we would really throw in that fog. Sorry about the feet. It's like they're getting worse and worse. But this is just for the demonstration. So we would throw all of this simultaneously into the distance, and that might help, but that would really accentuate what's happening on the surface here. Is she on a hill? I mean, it would be better if she was on a hill or something like that, but still eons away from where you were before, which was a little bit too confused. Everything was, even the grass was glowing, which was unusual. So it's up to you what you want to do. You can still bring down, you can still bring up the saturation, sorry. You can still do something with that. Actually, I'm going to keep this layer and lower the opacity of it just a touch. Delete that far side, and then lower the opacity, sorry, and then just saturate this scene. So we're at least at the same saturation you were in before. And then if you really wanted that extra explosion of color, you would saturate the foreground. Select saturate the foreground. So you have that explosion of color. If you do that, you know what's next. You desaturate the background. You can't have these two fighting each other. So before, after. I think this one is better. I think there's so much more magic here. It's attracting our eyes. It feels like the magic that's supposed to be felt. Those are fish and we can barely see them. So you might want to consider doing something with the fish as silhouettes as well against the light around them. And because the focal point is happening here, we can saturate around the focal point. Just in these immediate areas, we can saturate and leave everything back there desaturated, saturating only closest to the sun, ever so slightly. So her dress gets to be pink because we're getting closer to the light, or not closer to the light source, closer to the focal point, which is, of course, her and her pet, whatever color they are. All right, so before, after, beautiful environmental control, because we started with the very first question: what is the light source and what is it doing, and what is the environment of that light source? For this scene, again, same thing. The framing is a little bit off. For this type of character, what I would do is just shrink them in their environment. Definitely, when you have an environment first, when you have a character in an environment, the environment happens first, the character happens after that. So we're trying not to, I'm going to just probably lose a lot of detail this way if I don't select it all. The environment happens first if there's a character in an environment. That's just the rule, because the world is bigger than the character. The character can't seem like they tower over every single tree, even though we're seeing the environment. So, you know, when you step outside and you look at a house and the house looks tiny, and then that's because you're comparing that house to the massive spaces and the sky around and the size of the clouds and the scale of everything else. You go in that house, you're like, holy crap, this house is a lot bigger from the inside. That's not because the house is designed in a certain way where it still looks big. No, the house is tiny still. It's still a small space. If you jump on a trampoline, you're going to hit your head. But it's no longer in a comparison scale between the environment around. So there's no longer clouds or a distant mountain range that makes the house feel tiny. You no longer have that point of reference. So what do? We shrink the character in this environment, because now we're saying the character is just as big as these trees, which is of course not true. Unless she is a giant. If she is a giant, then now you know what to do. So this is a lot of patching up, but I like patching up because it makes the before and after a lot more successful. And I'm trying to follow your cues here with the environment trees, the perspective and the environment and the trees. Might take some creative liberties and just do different shapes for the trees. As you guys know me, I always take the creative liberty. All right. Okay, so doing some more, and then, oh, of course, there's her who is causing most of the trouble. Okay, so what is the problem? Essentially, the same thing. We have a scene that is an outdoor, pale white, beautiful, forgiving green, beautiful green, and we have a character who is not in silhouette, and we don't have a direction for this light source. She seems like she's a healing character, she's a life giver. We want to make her dressed in that light. It's part of how we design, that's part of how we create an atmosphere, is with these large brush strokes of soft brush. That's how it works. So throwing in this large brush stroke with the light environment, pale green white, is what's going to help us set this up. You could leave it as this, and this is a beautiful game loading screen splash. You could leave it right here, successful, perfect, exactly as it's supposed to be. But if you don't want that, of course, you're going to have to erase away at the character so they end up looking a little bit more readable in their environment, which is, and look at how I'm deleting. I'm deleting the far half first, and I'm trying to cast some shadows off of that light source. Trying to decide what the light source can and cannot see. And then there is still the fact of the environment. So a lightened layer. Using that environment dark green, I'm going to try to throw her off into the distance just a little bit. So we have more drowning light, but she still has some contrast, and we have more environment colors. And then I'm just going to cast that long shadow over the ground, and that long shadow will help create an environment for the glow of this little section here to really come through. And I think this cast shadow did a lot of work. Just a tiny little cast shadow, and we've created this beautiful space around the character. There are some places that I can't, completely repaint for you, so there's some of that environment blue here of the surface of the ground around her. And then there's just more foliage that you should be exploring. This tree, I feel, is a little bit too chunky. I feel like it needs a little bit more form. And then maybe there's like another tree in the distance somewhere out there. And that tree will only be a step down in darkness, of course. So darken. Just like so. And then we have the glowing yellow. So you chose a very complicated setup here, but we can just saturate the glowing yellow and then try to create a halo of it as well with a warmer yellow. So that's her healing power. That's an identification color. So we can just really try to push it as well. Alright, so that alone has done a lot. I would love some more pronounced kind of leaves and shapes to the leaves in the foreground. Something like, something a little bit more like that. Maybe some mushroom silhouettes. I'm not sure how I want to represent these leaves here in the foreground. I'm just going to use a shape I'm familiar with. And then I'm just applying them here. Okay, so that's really going to help. And the foreground this way can be a bit more blue. But both, oh, I didn't have enough on this side. Both have to be blurred. So this one will be a little bit more blurred. Filter, blur. But your staging here is wonderful. I love where she is in the relief. Definitely beautiful job establishing her as a focal point. I might try to burn some of her values back to where you had them before. Whoa, oh my god, that was horrible. That really was a burn. But yeah, I really liked how she was drowning in the light in that initial edit that I did. It just feels a little bit more authentic to the light source. And it makes her feel, innocent. It makes her feel like she's guiltless, which is kind of what we want out of a character that's representing healing, like this innocence. And she is also beautiful, so there's that, the divinity, the beauty, like that kind of virgin beauty type thing. And there you go. So let's take a look at the before and after. There's a fog everywhere. That fog might be nice to throw into the foreground as well, to help set up. It's not so much of the fog, it's just like the mist of the morning kind of thing. To throw some of it into the foreground. These have to be matched to their environment color, so you can complete the scene. So I'm just going to darken toward them. Oh, something more like that. So flatten, copy, and let's see what the before looks like. I'm always excited for these. Before, yep, too big, occupied the landscape way too much. She seemed like she was a giant because she's right beside a tree almost. After, way more environment, better scale comparison, more space thrown off into the distance. And now that we have these set up foreground and mid, kind of mid foreground, we can kind of give her her own little environment haze to throw her off even more into the distance, as you can see. And it's just a touch more fog in front of her to just disconnect her from the foreground. But it's not necessary. It's not absolutely necessary. We've already applied all the depth that we need to apply. There is something else you can do, which is just because she is in a foreground does not mean that she doesn't get those spikes of white. She can absolutely get them all the white. Just make sure that when you are throwing them in, you're not just throwing them in anywhere willy-nilly. Like you have some white here on the dark side, which is not acceptable. How did that happen? The light doesn't wrap around like wallpaper, and it's not directly behind her. And if we do have any kind of light out here, it would just be a rim light that has caught some flyaway hairs. But you've completely thrown off your light environment and your light, period, when you over-illuminate. This lower part can be illuminated because that's the bounce light coming back up. But right up, as soon as that shape looks away from the light, that should not happen, which makes this area here a little bit more functional. As an area that is drowning in light. Right? So you can follow that method. Oh, coming for me. Alright. And that still works very, very fine. There's no damage to the light of the glow of the character. We're still technically responding to the same light sources. We didn't just introduce a new light source. We're applying all that white on a main character. Her head is just bothering me. It just seems a little bit bulbous and overgrown. Even if she's looking down, it shouldn't be that much of a shift. As you can see before, it was kind of oversized. So, before, after. You want to add a pool of water, go ahead. That will glimmer even more. And I really, really think that taking some time for your light environments changes absolutely everything. So all of this was under the same topic, light environment. Let's talk about the others. So referencing, all of that stuff. So there's this piece with this reference. There is this piece with this reference. Done. There is this piece with this reference. This piece had a reference, but that's not what I want to talk about so much. And then finally we have a form study, and we have another photo reference. Okay, so one thing that's happening with this round, I'm going to just try to run over all of the major things you didn't capture in the reference. Excuse me. So here we have a lot of relief between the eyebrow and the eye. You close that relief. You made the inner part of the eyebrow lower than the arc, which is why she looks angrier. So you need to relax her expression. An eyebrow that is raised on the interior is a relaxed expression. Write that back to me, and that means that we won't be able to encounter so much negative out of that representation. You also didn't follow the same light environment, so that's a problem. And then her mouth is not as open and not as a smile. Her mouth was kind of distressed. So good job not drawing every single individual tooth, but we do have a problem with the way you represented the laugh line of the cheek. Even if it's a drawing that you reference out of a photo, never apply it that way. Try to capture the shape of the cheek with values instead of, with the line, because it will cause this really, really bad read in the age. Even if the photograph gets away with it, it's a photograph. It gets to get away with it. But we as the viewers, when we look at a painting, we do not look at it as we do a photograph. We look at it through the mind's kind of eye, where we see only one thing at a time. And a camera sees multiple things at a time. So it gets away with showing too much information. But as you can see, I'm throwing more cast shadows and contrast around the eyes. That's because the eyes are the focal point, and we're trying to exaggerate the eyes as the focal point. The light is coming from above, so the top of the nose is illuminated, but you darkened it, and that's not good. Follow the reference. Follow what the light source says in the reference. It's just fundamental to being able to capture the exact same light environment and recording that environment in your mind's eye. That means the lower part of the nose is in shadow. The lower part here is in shadow. This is in shadow, but the top part of the chin has a very pronounced highlight that you did not capture. You see that highlighter right there? And that's problematic as well, because it's, again, throwing off the light environment as something else. Mouths, even if they smile, should be overblended. Overblending this area, overblending anything that when it's over sketched makes the character look like they're 100 years old, but only in the lower half of their face. We're smudging and blending the edge of the cheek just a little bit, just so that we're not over representing edges that are not part of the focal point. And then we're bringing in our white and exaggerating all of the light around the character. And I'm kind of inventing my own face anatomy right now, just changing it along my own cues for my visual library. And that's going to help throw the focal point back up where it needs to be. You know what? I'm just going to select the old layer and delete where the edges are with my blocking brush. So rewatch the recording. Make sure you guys are capturing and taking notes, all the major fundamental changes and why I made them, so that you get the best, the most for your critique, and move on from there. So not every reward will be this kind of personalized critique. Of course, this is very, very difficult for me to do, especially because we have so many apprentices. There will, I hope, be time soon after I move, after I get settled in, where I finally start painting again, and start exploring my new skill and all the skills that I developed in my time off, because you still improve having not painted. Something happens in your brain where it just updates the latest software, and you just somehow see things differently. And I cannot wait to see how that has happened to me. So as you can see, I built a more direct response to the light source and made some choices of my own to help promote the focal point. What you see in a painting is not exactly what you see in a photograph is not exactly what you recreate in your painting. Write that back to me. An anatomy, you copy that. Light, you copy that. But because you change the light environment, I have some changes to make with the way that we're representing the focal point. So this may have frozen on me again. Not sure why Photoshop does this. Oh, it didn't. Oh, thank the Lord Almighty. So I'm gonna just flatten that and save, and then let's take a look at the before and after. So before, you see how it felt a little crushed? You felt angry. That's because you weren't really opening up the space of the eyebrow. So before, after. And you see how I built the volume of the top of the head, and now it looks like it's its own photograph now, because we promoted the light with a little bit more detail. You see how her mouth felt like it was a bit roaring? And we don't miss that contrast on the cheek, do we? It's kind of overdone. And it's not necessarily what we're supposed to be capturing the most of when we look at a photograph. All right, let's take a look at this one. So this is in reference to this anime character. So when you are trying to copy an anime character, what you want to do is try to recreate the type of eye they have and find an equivalent. You made a very effeminate face because the eye that we're looking at here, so liquefy and then open the reference up. The eye that we're looking at is not necessarily that effeminate when we, when we're applying our changes. So male eyes are smaller. His eyes are kind of slanted upwards. We shift that down and we get rid of the arc in the eyebrow. It's not necessarily that he has an arc, because anime is not able to show all that information. He does not have an effeminate face. He has strong, kind of effeminate, yes, in the basic standard of things. But in anime, he's still a man. So we're going to give him male template head shape, which means strong jaw, strong chin, a larger, wider nose, and thinner lips, and more distance in between the nose and the mouth. Alright, so he's starting to read as a male. Slowly but surely. I really want to thin out the lips. And I want to bring down the corner of the eye so it reads as a bit more male. The head is a bit large for the body. Okay, and then we have the issue with the eye. So the eye needs to be a more hooded eye, because at the moment it's reading as a really, really feminine eye. And male eyes, because the eyebrow bone is so low, we hood them. Okay. Still very beautiful, but not necessarily female. And then the eyebrow also needs to be lowered. And flattened. Not necessarily to make him mad, because lowering it would make him look angry, but just so that we can show that it's a masculine eye. So before, after, and then you'll see the full before and after, and you'll see why it did not read as a male at all. Now at least we know we're moving in the direction of a male, just based off that bone structure. We also do not want to use circular bone structure for the cheekbones. We want to use a more angular, triangular shape. We want to give more light to the jawline, because what that will do is create the feeling of a stronger jaw. And we want to kind of just, because he's a younger character, I guess, kind of just bring that chin down. You can give him stronger jowls as he's a male, and a thinner face as well. Careful with those lower eyelids. A hood for a male is both upper and lower, and we don't necessarily need it there the whole way. Men have something of a darker eye area over here, because we're just used to that aesthetic for males, because we've never dressed males with as much makeup as females. So the template for females doesn't have dark circles. And depending on how old he is, we could have more of a shadow for a beard. That might help as well, or mustache. That'll definitely help him read as more mature. And it's just slight. Oh, it's not slight at all. Oh, my pen pressure is gone, I think. Oh, there it is again. It leaves and comes back on its own. The head still feels a bit small to me, but I don't want to shrink it anymore. I think because he's wearing armor and all that, there should be a much larger imprint of that armor on his silhouette. I mean, we have layers and layers of metal and all of that stuff. Don't want to give him too long a neck because that is feminine. So before, after, and yeah, I don't want it to feel like he's also wearing his dad's armor. Let's kind of enlarge the head again, but not too big for the canvas or not too big along the shoulder line. That's the thing when you're drawing these anime characters, they all feel a little bit feminine no matter what you do. I think I'm going to shrink the length of the head just a bit, which I may have exaggerated too much. But the rules of making a character look feminine, masculine are very simple, and we forget them when we draw too much of one gender for too long, but that's not an excuse. Oh yeah, I drew girls for too long. It's not an excuse. You still have to understand the differences between the two. So before, very, very female. After, a lot more masculine. Angular eyes. We tilted the outer corner a little bit. Flattened the eyebrow. Got rid of the eyebrow arc. Not so much of an upper eyelid space. More distance between the nose and the mouth. Thinner mouth. Larger nose. Wider nose. More square jawline. Larger body. Okay. Oof, lots of changes. Let's move on. For this piece, the reference for it has way more contrast. So this piece is unfinished at the moment. You also are falling under the same traps as you would, when you're trying to bring in too much information from a photograph. It's also not the best lighting to use, and for someone who is only just getting into photo referencing, do not use a full-on smile. That is way too much work for a student who's just getting into photo referencing. You need to learn how to measure. You need to learn how to manage your contrast. So a big tip for you: drop this study and find the same exact face. If it's someone you know, ask them to just have a neutral face or a slight delicate smile. You can even keep it in 3/4 view, but I recommend front view for now, just so you can perfect your contrast, and then go back and apply it. Because if you're at the point where you're painting every single space between each tooth, you should have graduated into your darkest blacks already. Let's look at the time. So for this piece, it's the same thing, but you've actually done a really good job of not capturing too much detail too soon. I'm not sure if you stenciled over the reference or you're just working from it, but you need more values. So between this stretch of space and this stretch of space is a lot of volume. So just squint your eyes. We can see a lower drop. So I'm going to block in what you still have left to do. And I recommend, again, just like the one from before this one, go back and apply your changes, reattempt it. There's a drop in value just over here. There's a lot more plain than you can see. This side value of the nose actually exists all the way out here. Look at where her nostrils end. You gave us a really thin bridge, but you gave us wide nostrils, so that's not right. The nostrils and the bridge are intact. They are together, which means the sides of the nostrils also get the same value. And that way you have a more believable bridge value, which is the highest point of the face. Squint your eyes, you can see it's one of the highest points, and it just sits like that with a point on it. The top of her head needs another block, and then we have the lower half of the face, which needs an entire block as well. Please make sure you go back and apply these changes. There needs to be more planes, more information needs to be happening at this stage you are blocking. So it means that it's a very, very delicate time. Easy to make a mistake easy to make a mistake and easy to forget about your fundamentals. Good job not showing the spaces in between the teeth. I really like that. Make sure the chin values, the lower half values, don't come close to any of the values sitting at the top of the face. Just compare. Look at this big blotch of shadow when you squint your eyes and compare it back to here. We want to make sure that's the same thing happening. Look at the block missing in between the eyebrows. You have a whole block missing, which should be present. And then you have the sides of the face, which also need their own blocks because they are part of that cube that wraps around. And that's all it is. That's all painting is. You're just bringing in more polygons. And now you can start blending. Once you get a better idea of what's happening in the face around the eyes, now you can start blending. She has hooded eyes, so she needs a much larger brush stroke to get that ready. And this is how we would just basically start detailing. We just jump into smaller and smaller groups of values. Eventually the painting gets finished, because the brush keeps shrinking and finding more surface polys, and that means the brush is starting to detail. Okay, let's move on. For this piece, the issue with it is that you have lots of head and not enough face. Or the face is just not positioned right in the canvas. So you have the temple and the hairline, which is how I'm finding the eyebrow line, right? And I'm enlarging that. You have a really, really tiny nose and the mouth that isn't positioned right. So I'm going to enlarge the nose. The mouth is going to enlarge with it, which will shrink back. So I'm just enlarging the nose at the moment, and then the mouth needs to be shrunken back and placed along that new symmetry line. And then we have before, after, and then we have a more powerful kind of chin here that you've blended in with the side of the neck a little bit too much. Okay, and then you have the hair, the neck, and the ear ending off pretty awkwardly. And then we're seeing a lot of the lower part of the nostril, but the head is not tilted up. I'm trying to bring in more symmetry here. And then you have this really distressed expression. I recommend you go for something a little bit more neutral for now. But if you have to have it, at least find a good reference to help you set it up. Now we have a present jawline, and I think things look a little bit more acceptable now, less awkward. It's like the head was in a different perspective and the face was on a completely different tilt. Do you see that? So now the head hairline and the eyebrow line are on the same line. Before, this one was moving down. All right, and then for this piece, technically, outside of the light source, we would have, because the light source is small and we can see it in the canvas, technically, we would have a gradient in the background, respecting that. And guess what the gradient value is? It's the shadow color you chose for the darkest side of the shapes. That's because the light is so small, it's nearly nighttime. Some of these shapes are exposed to light, some aren't. I'm just confused as to why this shape has a bright side to it. I get this one because it's under the light, but this one is nearly eclipsed. So this shape, unless this light is in between them, which would do a very different thing to this shape. Yeah, so unless the light was between them, we really would not be getting any light on this shape here, because this shape is in the way of this. We're not seeing the side that's looking at the light. These have a slope to them, so we get to see the light, but this one is tilted away. There's really no way around it. They might have some bounce light to them because of these nearby shapes. I mean, at most, they would have some kind of bounce light, this surface, but that's it. All right, and so that's why I don't recommend doing form studies with a visible light source. For this one, there needs to be more foreshortening. I know you're doing it in pen, so it's impossible to fix it now, but you can always edit it. But the foreshortening is what happens when we have field of view, this depth kind of change. And so the head being look at how big her foot is, and look at how small her head is. So that's what we're trying to capture over here, so it actually feels like we're in perspective. Not the best way to study, definitely not the best option for perfecting your fundamentals, pen on lined paper. But you know, sometimes we get a desire to draw, and it just has to happen no matter what media we're working with. So I'm shrinking the hand so it feels like it's in the distance. And in your drawing, you're allowed to exaggerate these features. So you can always exaggerate the fundamentals even more. Fundamentals can be exaggerated, though they can't be skipped. So we have more of an inward dent and an outward hip thrust, sort of. So now we have more, Street Fighter type, cartoony type, which I think is what you're going for. Comic book type for shortening drama. All right, this was super fun. I can't wait to do this again. Hopefully next month we have some time lapse, but because I'll be moving, I'll be working on my house 24/7 for a straight 2 weeks. I'll hopefully be able to put up my office as soon as possible. By this week, hopefully, I will also be done with your critiques for your environment challenges, and the assignments for this month will also be handed out very soon. Thank you everyone for your patience for this long video, and thank you for watching the whole video if you did. Let me know your feedback. I would love to see some corrections handed into the corrections text channel, and write it back to me. I want all those fundamentals, even the ones that I didn't ask you, write it back to me at Istebrak me on the Discord, and write it back to me. I'd love to see what you guys say. Bye guys.